Okay, yeah. So, dear participants and all of you who are watching this, greetings. I'm Somava Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC, and I would like to warmly welcome you all again to our today's session. Today's session, we are back with another book discussion, focusing on a new book, The Last Treaty, Lausanne and the End of the First World War in the Middle East by Michel Tusan, published this June by Cambridge University Press. This year, 2023, as many of you might know, marks the centennial anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne, and Professor Tusan's book comes out at a very significant time. We are truly honored to host a discussion on the last treaty, which tells the story of how the First World War ended in the Middle East, tracing Europe's war with the Ottoman Empire through to the signing of Lausanne. For our viewers, I would like to give you a brief note on our Lausanne series. The CGC is commemorating the Lausanne anniversary by hosting a series of events. Earlier, we had hosted a book discussion on Professor J. Winter's The Day the Great War Ended, 24 July 1923, followed by a book discussion on Professor Hans Lucas Kaiser's When Democracy Died, and a panel on the anniversary of the Treaty of Lausanne. Professor Tusan's The Last Treaty is the fourth event in the series. This series would end with an online lecture on August 23 by Peter Balakian. For more information on this series, please keep following our CGC website and other social media handles. For now, let me introduce our today's featured speaker and the book author, Professor Michel Tusan. Professor Michel Tusan is the Professor of History at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. As a historian, her teaching and research interests broadly engage in the relationship between geopolitics, culture, and human rights, with expert areas in modern British history, British Empire, and history of women. She was a fellow in the humanities at Stanford and president of the North American Conference on British Studies. She's the author of numerous publications, namely The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide, Humanitarianism and Imperial Politics from Gladstone to Churchill, Smyrna's Ashes, Humanitarianism, Genocide, and the Birth of the Middle East, and Women Making News, Gender, and Journalism in Modern Britain. It is a great privilege and honor to have you with us, Professor Tusan, along with our other discussants, Professors Ronald Grigor-Suni and Professor Don Chatty, whom I shall introduce a little later today. Professor J. Winter, I would also like to warmly welcome you to be part of this session as our chief panelist, who would be also joining us during the discussion. Professor Winter is an eminent historian and as well as our association member. By now, everyone should know him. Yeah, so thank you very much all for joining this panel. Now, without further delays, I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Michel Tusan for her opening remarks. Professor Tusan, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Somava. I'd like to start by thanking you and the organizers, as well as our distinguished commentators, for participating today in this discussion. It's really an honor to be here. Do I sound okay? Yeah? Okay, great. My new book explores how and why the First World War ended with the signing of the Lausanne Treaty between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire in 1923. Today, I'd like to highlight the key arguments from the book using some maps and illustrations. I'd now like to share my screen so you can see some of these maps. Let me see if I'm going to do this right. Let's see. No? Doesn't look like it did it. Yes, you can see it. Terrific. Okay, if you can't see it, please interrupt me.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
And is it in presenter mode? Because mine is not. Let's see. Yes? Is that good? No? Was it better before?
No, it's fine. It's fine. We can see it.
You can see it and it'll be advance. Okay, let me know if it's not working. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The book focuses on the Middle Eastern Front, a term I deployed to describe the war in the Ottoman territory in the Eastern Mediterranean that included the struggle for what was then called Mesopotamia, as well as North Africa and Anatolia. The First World War, as I argue, was a war of empires. It started in the Balkans and ended in the Middle East. It paralleled the war fought in Europe between the Central Powers led by the German and Austro-Hungarian empires and the Allies led by the British, French, Russian, and American empires. What I'm calling the long war between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire had devastating consequences for civilian populations caught in its wake. Telling the history of the First World War from the rear view of Lausanne forces a reassessment of military operations, humanitarian activities, and diplomatic dealings that continued after the signing of the Versailles Treaty between the Allies and Germany in 1919. The recent resurgence of interest in the First World War has yielded important research on the long-term implications of fighting in the Middle East and, to a lesser extent, Asia and Africa. Historians now understand how this war that started in Europe became a global war. We need to see beyond Europe in order to reassess both the war's geographical and chronological boundaries. My book considers Allied and Ottoman peacemaking between 1918 and 1923 as a crucial and final chapter of the First World War. For the Allies, making peace with the Ottoman Empire that had fought on the side of the vanquished Central Powers meant navigating the space between the nation state and new global alignments where humanitarianism, international justice, and refugee policy found new and uneasy articulation. Britain played an outsized role in determining the course of the peace settlement, first at Sèvres and later Lausanne. Along with its French ally, Britain guided the peace process to advantage an imperial system that protected European global supremacy within the nascent international system. Both powers sought to protect and expand their empires while managing American interests. So too did the Ottoman Empire. Diplomatic and private correspondence chronicling three key moments, the Madras Armistice, the Treaty of Sèvres, and the Treaty of Lausanne, reveal how imperial politics influenced the conclusion of a war the Allies no longer wanted to fight. And this map I have before you, really, I'm hoping to sort of broaden our scope of the fronts of the war. And you can see how I put the Middle Eastern front here on equal footing with the Eastern, the Alpine, the Western, the Balkan front. And I think that's an important ability. We need to visualize the war in this way, I think, to fully understand its truly global scope. Britain negotiated an armistice with the Ottoman Empire in October 1918. It failed to end the fighting. Negotiators arguably were more focused on the simmering rivalry between Britain and France than finding a sustainable peace with the Ottoman Empire. Britain rebuffed French demands to have a hand in negotiations, claiming that such action amounted to little more than, quote, butting in. The armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed at Madras in the Aegean Sea on a British Navy destroyer almost 2 weeks before the armistice with Germany. Each of the victorious powers had something they wanted, but the war resisted easy resolution, and those ambitions became harder and harder to realize. In short, the armistice refused to yield a blueprint for a sustainable peace. World War I followed the long European tradition of ending wars by treaty, and I'm interested to hear what Professor Chatty has to say about the differences here. The peace conference here serves as a primary vehicle for making peace. Diplomats, as they had in Vienna and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, gathered together for an extended period in a European capital to discuss boundaries, economic costs, and consequences for the vanquished. In the case of World War I and the Middle East, treaty making did not proceed smoothly or swiftly and caused anxiety among belligerents who could not say for sure if they were at war or at peace. The unsettled state of the peace resulted in 24 official conferences after 1918 armistice, after the Madras Armistice, in addition to numerous ad hoc meetings. In the midst of these protracted peace negotiations, fighting raged on in the Middle East. These were not intermittent skirmishes on borderlands, but full-scale military engagements that claimed tens of thousands of civilian and military casualties well beyond 1918. And the core of the book is really that 1918 to 1923 period is what I focus on. I talk about the earlier bit, but I really want to know what happened after 1918. Military confrontations happened all over the region and included the Greek invasion of Smyrna and subsequent reconquest of the region by Mustafa Kemal, the Allied offensive in southern Anatolia, and Britain's mission to check Russian ambition in the Caucasus. The Treaty of Sèvres marked the first attempt to make peace with the Ottoman Empire and was signed by Ottoman representatives of the Allied-backed government in Constantinople, of course, modern-day Istanbul, in August 1920. This treaty sought to divide Turkey much along the lines of the 1960 Sykes-Picot Agreement. Hope you can see that. You probably don't even need to see this map. You've seen it so many times. And that was signed during the war. So this was the sort of, people have always argued this is the blueprint, but I don't think that's entirely the case. Here you see the Ottoman Empire divided between a French, British, Italian, Russian, and international sphere. This division never materialized, of course, as we know, because the Lausanne Treaty replaced Sèvres in 1923. What I think is crucial is to understand what Sèvres did do, rather than focus on its failures. I think it really did a lot for good or evil here. It created conditions that led to the continuation of war primarily and fueled armed conflict that exacerbated an already urgent humanitarian crisis. It mirrored in many ways earlier treaty making between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, where imperial preoccupation shaped the terms of peacemaking around the idea of minority protection and humanitarian intervention. These priorities, these old 19th century priorities, I think I'm a Victorianist at heart here, they really help explain, I think, why it was so hard to forge a peace in 1920. This long history of relations between Europe and the Ottoman Empire explains Sèvres, I think. Territorial and humanitarian questions historically had driven relations between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. And these concerns shadowed diplomatic dealings, I think, starting with the Greek Wars of Independence in the 1820s. The 1856 Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War between Europe and the Ottoman Empire introduced provisions that for the first time protected Ottoman religious minorities, mostly Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and Jews as part of the peace. The 1878 Treaty of Berlin that ended the Russo-Turkish War extended these protections and gave Britain explicit charge to protect Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Berlin's 66 articles, remarkably, 11 of them dealt with minority civil and political rights. It's remarkable that a treaty would spend that much time on that issue, I think, in the 19th century. Article 44 applied to Jewish minorities. Article 61 of the Berlin Treaty codified Britain's leadership role regarding Christians. Ultimately, what Carolyn Fink calls paper threats, these paper threats did little to benefit Ottoman Christians or Jews. The minority protection articles, however, marked a watershed moment regarding the question of whether a state had an obligation to intervene in the internal affairs of another state on humanitarian grounds. And this, I think, these treaties really shaped Allied war making with or peacemaking and their dealings with the Ottoman Empire up through World War I. Remember, most of these guys who are negotiating the peace are Victorians. I mean, these guys are these are 19th century mindset folks who are remembering these things. And I think these treaty negotiations have a very powerful afterlife, if you will, and they really are shaping what's going on at Sèvres and later Lausanne. The belief in minority protection, if you don't believe me, here's my next map. The belief in minority protection was behind, I think, this revised Sykes-Picot map configured largely around ethnographic lines. And here you see the powers replaced by where people should go. And there's lots of question marks, which I sort of love. But I think it dates back to this sort of it gestures to this earlier way of thinking about where people should be belonging, and that these interventions should have something to do with the question of minorities.
Ma'am,
So much so that
I think your slide is stopped. I think it is showing the first map.
The first map? Oh, we didn't go through the Sykes-Picot? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's end slideshow here. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can see. Yeah. Okay,
that's strange. All right. Well, you missed Sykes-Picot, but you know Sykes-Picot, right? Okay, so let me go back. Let's see. Okay, so if you can see this. So you can see that there's this original Sykes-Picot that we all know.
The second.
And this is the reconfigured one that's reconfigured in 1919. And you can see the ethnic, the way they have mapped these peoples onto the old Sykes-Picot geography, which I think is significant. This map goes nowhere, which is probably a reason we don't see it, but it is very much part of British thinking about the peace process, and it shows up in the diplomatic files. So based on this map, the plans to divide the Ottoman Empire along ethno-religious lines became increasingly unlikely after 1920. This map, again, is a dead letter, but I think it's important to understand the kind of thinking that goes into Sèvres and then later Lausanne. The Allies did not back the Sèvres Treaty with military force. While the Allies maintained a significant military presence during this period, a drawdown of troops began the summer after the signing of the armistice, when the British reduced its force from 1 million to 320,000 troops. Mustafa Kemal's nationalist movement gathered steam in the spring of 1920 and undermined Allied plans to divide the Ottoman Empire into European-controlled zones and establish an Armenian state in eastern Anatolia. The British responded by further tightening administrative control over Constantinople. This fueled further resistance to peacemaking when Sèvres was signed that summer by an Ottoman government largely propped up by the Allies. Britain felt particular unease about growing discontent in its own empire regarding this first treaty, Sèvres. In India, the massacre at Amritsar in April 1919 of unarmed Indian civilians by the British served as a catalyst for Gandhi's non-cooperation movement and represented an important moment in the delegitimization of colonial rule. Gandhi, alongside highly respected Muslim leaders, agitated against the Treaty of Sèvres and attempted to unite the nationalist cause against British rule in India. Gandhi considered Britain's treatment of the Ottoman Empire as an affront to Indian Muslims. As Gandhi said, the wrongs done at Amritsar and the infamous Treaty of Sèvres required repentance on the part of the British government. Very strong statement in 1920, I'm sorry. Others worried about alienating Indian public opinion and spoke against Sèvres. Quote, "From the moment this treaty was signed," warned one British official, "we should have for the first time a movement comparable to the Sinn Féin movement breaking out in India in favor of complete separation from England." Opinion, however, was far from united. On the other side of the debate were those who maintained that the Allies were fighting a war against, quote, "Turkish militarism" and to secure self-determination for Armenians, Arabs, and Assyrians, mainly. This is another ethnographic map. Oops. Can you see that one? Yeah, okay. Again, not a popular one that we see too often, but this one actually was submitted by the Assyrian delegation to the peace conference. I'm sorry, I got lost. Indeed, negotiating this treaty was important here, and this map supported by the Assyrian delegation really, I think, shows how these causes were at the center of thinking about this during the early conference at the Versailles conference. In April 1919, this debate about whether or not to support claims of so-called small nationalities, and that's not my term, that's their term. They use the term small nationalities, and they include in this group the Assyrians, the Armenians, even the Greeks, believe it or not, Kurds. These came to a head over the issue of war crimes against perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. Still keen to enforce the terms of the armistice that promised justice for POWs and massacre victims, British officials launched an extensive investigation. Dozens of pages of evidence made the case for the prosecution of Ottoman perpetrators. The evidence was intended for presentation to the Versailles Peace Conference that April, as news of the massacre at Amritsar in 1919 reached delegates. The report was presented on April 22nd, but never received a full hearing. As a result, the so-called Constantinople war crimes trials limped along that spring, succeeding in only further fueling Turkish nationalist resentment of Allied occupation. So all of these factors are swirling around this peacemaking process at Sèvres. Negotiating a treaty that enforced armistice dictates regarding war crimes, which had been a central concern 2 months earlier, now seemed remote at best. Indeed, by the time Sèvres was signed in the summer of 1920, the question of war crimes already was a dead letter. Backing away from war crimes prosecutions did little to ease military tensions. As you can see from the map I started with, Sèvres negotiations Sever's negotiations were overshadowed by skirmishes between Allied forces and the reconquest of Anatolia by Mustafa Kemal's nationalist army. And you can see those in the corner there. The dashes that I have around, those are the lines of reconquest that's happening during this time. That's where those skirmishes are happening on the Middle Eastern front. The strength of Kemalist forces in these kind of dotted lined areas in the Middle East, or what we call the Middle East, really threatened the Greek and Allied position at this moment in 1920. The reports of massacres of Muslim civilians by occupying Greek troops further strengthened the Turkish nationalist backlash. In early September 1922, Britain attempted the, quote, complete evacuation of Asia Minor, no easy feat, as the strength of the Kemalist army grew. Kemalist forces soon entered Smyrna after chasing a retreating Greek army, and they chased around there were also 50,000 refugees in addition to the army itself. Many suspected that the violence would get worse in Smyrna and around that area of reconquest, but few anticipated that the nationalist army would set fire to the city. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Turkish soldiers deliberately known as chets, starting the fires that would leave the city in ruins and render impossible peace negotiation pledges to both end the war and protect refugees. The burning of the Armenian and Greek quarters and passing over of the Turkish quarter in Smyrna led to the conclusion that the fire was started in part to take revenge on those who had supported the Allied occupation. The carnage left in the wake of Smyrna and the battles that preceded it destroyed the Ottoman Empire's key commercial Mediterranean port city, today it's modern day Izmir, Smyrna at the time. And it also, I think, significantly destroyed its entire population of non-Muslim inhabitants. To Churchill, Winston Churchill, of course, the burning of Smyrna marked the, quote, final act in the tragedy of the Great War. And here's this picture of the refugees on the Smyrna pier taken by an American journalist. Though never enforced, Sever's plans for Turkey provided fuel for the nationalist resurgence that we see the results of here. British were driven back from what was then left of their hold in Turkey at Chanak around the time of the Smyrna fire. Kemalists now held full control over what was left of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia. The failure of Sever to stop the fighting made a new treaty inevitable. Less than 2 months after the last fires died out in Smyrna, the Allies were back at the table and ready to make the necessary concessions for peace. And I do think this chronology is important. 2 months after this fire, they're renegotiating a treaty. I don't think this is an accident. These are important timelines. The final agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, reflected a new reality. Quote, though Turkey had shared the final defeat of the Central Powers, the nationalists had never ceased fighting, one commentator observed. In peace conferences, there should be a victor and a vanquished, but at Lausanne, the vanquished had become victorious. The powerful position of the newly legitimated Kemalist government on the heels of its victory over Greek forces meant that the Allies occupied a much weaker position than at any time after the armistice. 7 months of negotiations at Lausanne resulted in the revision of the entire Sevres agreement, as we know, including the minority treaty section, Allied occupation of Constantinople, and the freedom of the Straits. So all three of these things were thrown open again. On the eve of the opening of the Lausanne conference, one newspaper headline summed up the British position, quote, Constantinople must not be allowed to be a second Smyrna. So there was real fear that Constantinople would burn next if these negotiations did not happen. The Lausanne Peace Conference was animated by Britain's attempt to grab oil-rich Mesopotamia to shore up its hold over the Mediterranean and safeguard India. It also, or its colony, its hold over India, I shouldn't say. It wasn't about protecting India, but protecting the British Empire in India. It also kept pressure on the minority question, which the British cast as a strategic and humanitarian issue. Conference President Lord Curzon, pictured here, supported the national solution as part of Lausanne's mandate and argued that states divided along religious lines would offer the best answer to the, quote, changed conditions in the Near East. Curzon dedicated 3 sittings of the first part of the Lausanne conference to the problem of minorities, though he fully realized that Turkish negotiators would not agree to outside interference regarding how it dealt with the remaining Christian population in what was becoming the new Turkey. And this is the image of the Turkish delegation at Lausanne. In the end, both Allied and Turkish nationalist priorities shaped the end of the First World War. The Allies did divide Mesopotamia between themselves, but Turkey also prevailed by preventing the partition of Anatolia, which they reinvented as a Turkish homeland. They were fighting for empire just as much as the British and the French. And here's the image of these familiar maps, right? In Middle East on the eve of World War I and at the end. And I purposefully had the second map crafted in a way where you don't just see that it's a dividing up between the British and the French, because I do think at this conference, it isn't simply that the British and the French are reinventing colonialism, but there's a way of rejiggering empires that the Ottoman Empire is very much a participant in. So you don't see those shaded areas as dramatically as you often do on that second map on the right, and that is purposeful. So what does this all mean? I'll wrap it up. As my story today suggests, I think war and peacemaking were part of the same process, and this really matters. There wasn't peace, there wasn't war. War didn't stop and suddenly we had a peace process. It was happening in the midst of wartime. Extending the chronology of the war to include this little remembered treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, I think shows really why this was, why they kept fighting in the midst of attempting to go negotiate peace. The road to Lausanne merged humanitarianism, international justice, and refugee policy with imperial politics. To understand the years between 1918 and 1923 as part of the war rather than the post-war or even what some have called the Greater War, I think further blurs the lines between war and peace. The refugee crisis, relegated largely to the interwar years in most historiography, was not caused wholly by intractable differences between religions and age-old conflicts, but it was a result of actions taken during the final years of the war. Population transfer and repatriation campaigns were worked out under the conditions of war, where military battles determined particular outcomes and solutions. The extended peacemaking process also transformed international justice by exposing its imperial pedigree. The inability to prosecute perpetrators of the Armenian genocide came not from a lack of will, sympathy, or resources, but from questions about the survival of the British Empire in the face of nationalist resistance in India, and I guess you could also say Ireland, and the transition to post-imperial internationalism. The signing of the Treaty of Lausanne ended the War of Empires. Britain guarded its imperial and economic interests in Mesopotamia and Egypt with a special eye to protecting the Suez Canal, while France shored up its empire in North Africa and fought to control Syria. The Russian Empire led the war on the Caucasus until the Brest-Litovsk Treaty signed with Germany in spring 1918 took it out of the war. While the US never declared war on the Ottoman Empire, it contributed vast amounts of money and resources to the war's humanitarian infrastructure. The War of Empire was fought to preserve imperialism, not undo it, in the name of self-determination. Ultimately, wartime alliances contributed to an internationalism that maintained old European-led colonial relationships. The Allied focus on the Middle Eastern front escalated after Lloyd George took over as Prime Minister of Britain in 1916. But the Ottomans had their own war aims as well, to expand and strengthen their empire, which came into increasing focus as the war dragged on. Leaders did not merely follow what the Germans said, or weren't used simply, the Turkish soldiers weren't simply used as fodder in battles. This is the view most evident in some writing about Gallipoli. If you read most of the accounts of Gallipoli, the Turkish soldiers are really simply fodder for the Central Powers, but I don't think this is the case. British historiography still often portrays the Ottoman Empire as a pawn of Germany, and it lacking its clear war aims. This approach, I think, risks uncritically reproducing perceptions of some Allied military leaders at the time that the Ottoman Empire was simply an appendage of Germany. Like Britain, the Ottomans wanted to preserve and even expand their own empire, as seen in this cartoon. This is my favorite image. I wanted to put this on the cover of the book, but it wouldn't wrap around. It's kind of an incredible, I think it's an incredible image of, this is from 1919. This Turkish newspaper, nationalist newspaper, published this in 1919, and And Allied peacemakers sort of passed it around. This went straight to Lord Curzon. He said, look what we're up against. The Ottoman Empire hasn't given up when this 1919. You can see the image of the Ottoman warrior with his hand pinching Bonn over there in the corner. The peacemakers certainly knew that the Ottoman Empire was looking at expansion. If you see how his sword is pointing south towards the Mesopotamia, and he's looking towards Russia. These are clear messages that the Ottoman Empire is sending Allied peacemakers. As for the British, Lloyd George, he had we really can call him an unapologetic liberal imperialist. He clearly understood the war as a battle for the preservation of his own empire, of the British Empire. Like the Turks understand it as their empire, preservation of their empire, so does Lloyd George see it as the preservation of the British Empire. His own version of history defended his failure to fully recognize this aim and his frustration with being thrown out of office in 1922. The war as strange defeat makes sense looking backward from Lausanne, at least from the Allied perspective. President Wilson's rhetoric, sacralized in the 14 points, that the war was fought to uphold democracy, still haunts history books that continue to interrogate its ultimate failure. Like Lloyd George, who used nationalist aspirations outside of his own empire to support British imperial aims, President Wilson had his own priorities that included weakening European empires in order to increase US influence. We now know that the reality of the wartime settlement would serve whichever power emerged as the leading player in the conquered territories, including but not limited to the Middle East. I think looking backward from Lausanne shows how the narrative arc of the First World War as a good war gone bad was wrong from the beginning. The inglorious end of the war on the Middle Eastern front exposed notions of unchecked imperial expansion as an illusion. The First World War achieved less than victory for the Allies. This interpretation has long guided understanding for the interwar years, most especially in the service of seeing the war settlement as responsible for the Second World War. But the cracks in the war settlement were visible from the moment of the final peace. By 1923, the Allies lost the war that they thought they had won in 1918, and the First World War ended in defeat. Lloyd George recognized this in his own war memoirs. He called the final 2 volumes published in 1938, The Truth About the Peace Treaties. He dedicated most of the second volume to the settlement with the Ottoman Empire. As he concluded about Lausanne, and I will conclude here, quote, "No one claims that this treaty was peace with honor. It is not even peace." Thanks. That's it.
Thank you so much, Professor Tusan, for providing an excellent overview of your book and highlighting the stimulating theme and researches, what you have done. And you have opened a lot to discuss, and we would definitely take them up during the discussion period. But for now, I would like to go to our first panelist in order, Professor Ronald Rigor-Suni. Let me start by briefly introducing him to our audiences. Professor Ronald Rigor-Suni is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan and Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. Professor Suni is the world's leading historian and expert of Soviet, Armenian, and Georgian history, nationalism, empire, and genocide studies. He has served in several leading institutions and associations and has been awarded with several important awards and honors. He is the author of several award-winning publications, from which I would just name a few: The Baku Commune, 1917 to 1918, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution, The Soviet Experiment, Russia, the USSR and the Successor States, and Stalin, Passage to Revolution, his new book. His recent book, he received his BA from Swarthmore College and his MA and PhD from Columbia University. It is a great pleasure and privilege to have you with us, Professor Suni. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sumawa. You may introduce me anytime you like. That was the most wonderful thing. It sounded like a toast at a supra or banquet given by the Georgians, who always praise you to the sky and I take it with a grain of salt, but enjoyed it immensely. So thank you. And thank you for organizing this wonderful occasion. And thank you, Michelle Tusan, for writing a wonderful book. Why do I think it's a wonderful book? First of all, because I learned so much from it. And I always judged books, as long as I was teaching. I retired a year ago in June, whether I could, what could I steal from it? I mean, what could I, of course, properly footnote and use in my own work or in lectures. And this book is a wonderful book for adding to what we know about not only Lausanne, but the lost history of the Treaty of Sèvres. And the Treaty of Sèvres, I'm an Armenian by origins, though born in America, is a kind of sacred icon for Armenians. It's a lost hope, a lost aspiration of this Wilsonian grand Armenia that was supposed to be established as a just result of the sacrifice of Armenians and the defeat of the Ottomans. And of course, as you showed brilliantly in your book, it never occurred. You give the best telling I know of the best treatment of Sèvres that I think we have. What I like about the book so much is that you bring the Ottoman War on its many, many fronts deeply into into the fabric of the history of World War I. And you demonstrate that World War I did not end in 1918 or 1919 in the Middle East. It went on with the Kemalist struggle against the imperial powers and Armenia claims, Kurdish claims, and other remnants of the Ottoman Empire for some kind of resolution of their national aspirations. So this is a book of, I would say, important and radical historiographical revision in the best sense of the word revision, because that's what historians do in critical histories. They question the orthodoxies, the unquestioned assumptions of older understandings and bring us something new. And that's really the triumph and the achievement of this book. I love your idea that World War I was a war of empires. It's indisputable. I like very much a recent book I read by Richard Overy on the World War II, in which it too is an imperialist war. So in some ways, Lenin lives, as they always said in the Soviet Union. We now see the importance of imperialism, though in my education growing up, of course, imperialism was a dirty word and you couldn't use it in proper American discourses at that time in the 40s and 50s. So Armenians, I was very interested in the treatment of Armenians because Armenians were victims of this war, but as you show, they were as well an inspiration for the Allies, at least in their own self-conception, for reasons why they were fighting the war, along with the Belgian atrocities and other things. And that was fascinating, the way you tried and successfully, I think, brought together humanitarianism, humanitarian intervention, which was a kind of answer to the totalization of warfare that, of course, now involves civilians as much, if not more, than armies in this particular war. And I guess one of the questions I would love you to talk about, because you didn't so much in your own remarks, though it's in the book, but it'd be good for our audience and for me personally, is why the two come together. How you see humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention as part of what now seems to be in much of the literature. I'm thinking of Watt and Paul and my own colleagues here in Michigan. How humanitarianism is sometimes being questioned now, as if it's a new form of colonialism or a new form of imperialism, undermining and questioning the genuineness, the authenticity of humanitarianism. How would you deal with that question? And how indeed can we think about humanitarianism in this context of colonialism and in some ways outside the context of colonialism? Another point I would like to make, and I guess I'm treating this as a kind of academic discussion about questioning a text which I think is absolutely first rate. The way you deal with Armenians and particularly Kurds. Armenians do play a pretty good role in this story. I'm happy about that, of course. Armenians love if anyone, particularly non-Armenians, people we call Odars, even mention Armenians. If they say the word Barev, hello, we think it's just a great achievement. So we're a people that is afraid, in Milan Kundera's famous phrase, of being eliminated, of disappearing. And we know we can disappear because it's almost happened. But I worry more about the Kurds. I think that the Kurds are also, Armenians were eliminated. As Sykes says in that wonderful quote you gave, let's face reality. There are no Armenians left in much of Anatolia. But the Kurds are there. And the Kurds will be for a time allied at an important moment with the Kemalists, only to be betrayed by the new Turkish state and crushed by 1925 and rendered to their inferior position there. You know, the word in Turkish sumerge, which is colony, is used widely by Kurds today to describe their current position. If you go to Kurdistan, you will drive outside the city of Yuksekova or others through checkpoints, all the way as you drive to Van or whatever. So this is a colonial situation which was not resolved in the Ottoman period in Lausanne or whatever. Moreover, there's a different treatment of Armenians and Kurds in the treaty itself. Correct me if this is wrong, but Armenians had some rights. They were given schools, for instance. We still have Armenian schools, Turkified Armenian schools, in present-day Republic of Turkey, but no Kurd can go to school at age 5, 6, 7 in Kurdish. There's no Kurdish education. They go to school in Turkish from day one in their school. So there's a different kind of colonialism, or whatever you want to call it, in that way. I respect, not only in this book, but another book you wrote, the wonderful treatment of Smyrna, the last big event in this in World War I, you could say, and the conviction that you say it's no longer controversial, I think, in your treatment, that the city was set on fire by the Turks. I love the picture of the Turkish delegation that you just showed at Lausanne, dressed as British gentlemen with top hats, canes, frock coats. What a good semiotic achievement to come to Switzerland dressed as authentic elite Europeans. No fezzes here, of course, or turbans or whatever, but real European clothing. I guess my major question then is one that I bring up often, and you'll forgive me. I'm an anti-nationalist. I hope I'm still an internationalist. That term has been degraded by much of Soviet history, but I think it's a treasured thing for me. And I worry about the casual use in the book, the way you use the word nationalism. I think nationalism is too often used as an all-encompassing explanation. When you don't know why something happens, it's nationalism. That term is so prolific. That term is so has so many meanings clinging to it that it can mean almost anything. It can mean themes in an opera by Mussorgsky, like Boris Godunov, and it can mean Hitler's, Generalplan Ost to establish an empire in the East. It's too capacious. It has too great a capacity. So I would say that rather than the shorthand of nationalism, that we as historians generally hesitate and treat nationalism as a question rather than an easy answer. That is, why this form of what you're calling nationalism, and how are you defining it? Because after all, the aspirations of the small nations or nationalities, as you mentioned, were, in a sense, nationalists. That is, they wanted, on the basis of their shared culture, some kind of political representation, whether it be autonomy or statehood altogether. And that would be an aspiration to become a nation, and that was supported by Wilson and others at the Paris Peace Conference. Of course, this also means that the Kemalist movement has a deep legitimation, because even as it's conquering Anatolia and fighting against Armenians and Greeks, and this is an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, nationalist movement that ultimately the people at Lausanne will have to deal with. And the alliance with the Bolsheviks, of course, the anti-colonialists, most exemplary anti-colonialists at the time, made a lot of sense, both to Lenin and Kemal, though, of course, the Kemalists betrayed their own communists and murdered them. And this is not unlike, at the same time that all this is happening, and it might be brought into the picture, the way Pilsudski and the Poles wanted to take over Kiev, which they actually took at one point, much of Belarus, which they got, much of Ukraine, which they got as they fought the Soviets, and got their gains as good imperial nationalists in the Treaty of Riga. So this is an odd period where empires are being rebuilt, and you mentioned that Britain and France are bigger after the war than they were before the war, so it's an imperial success for some. At the same time, it's competing with the principle of nation and self-determination, this Leninist and later Wilsonian principle, which is developed first by social democrats and then by liberals. So it seems to me there's a very complex story here, and that we oversimplify and reduce it and flatten it if we don't examine seriously what we mean by nationalism, clearly define it, accept and refuse to accept simply the word itself as if it's clear to everyone what we're talking about. In any case, those are my major thoughts about the book, which I treasure because you taught me so much, particularly about the Treaty of Sevres, Treaty of Lausanne. So I am grateful for your achievement and your hard work and what you've given to me as a fellow historian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cerny. It was a wonderful comments from you. Professor Tusan, would you like to respond? Okay.
I'd be happy to wait for both commentators, and then we can talk. We can have a chat. If that's okay.
Yeah, sure. We can club it, yeah, definitely. So we would like to go to our second panelist, Professor Dawn Chatty. Let me briefly introduce her. Professor Dawn Chatty is an academic and practicing social anthropologist whose ethnographic interests lie in Middle East, particularly with nomadic pastoral tribes and refugee young people. Her research interests also include a number of forced migration and development issues such as conservation-induced displacement, tribal resettlement, modern technology, and social change. She has held appointments at various universities in the United States, Lebanon, Syria, and Oman, and has worked with a number of development agencies such as the UNDP, UNICEF, FAO, and IFAD. Her award-winning publications include From Camel to Truck, the Bedouin in the Modern World, Mobile Pastoralists, Development Planning and Social Change in Oman, and Syria, the Making and Unmaking of a Refugee State. It is a great honor to have you, Professor Dawn Chatty. Over to you for your comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. My perspective obviously is from the Middle East. And so I have a number of questions that I want to ask that maybe we can enter into more discussion. But first, let me say that I think, Dr. Tusan, you've really done us a great service by focusing in your book on why the war to end war, as it was called, of August 1914 to November 1918 and the peacemakers of Paris in 1919 were unable to bring peace to the Ottoman lands, which they renamed the Middle East, that being the perspective from Europe, differentiating between the Far East, the Middle East, and the Near East. In many ways, your book is two books, and I found that really fascinating. That one book is a fascinating revelation of the development of a form of humanitarianism being refugee camps, not concentration camps, as we first had in the Boer War in South Africa, but of refugee camps that are in a way an instrument of war, of bringing the local population, of protecting the civilian populations who were not enemy combatants, and unveiling. So that was really one fascinating part of the book, which then is interspersed with notions of how humanitarianism kind of took off during World War I, although I'll come back to that from an Ottoman perspective a little bit later. And also the other book is the way in which you unveiled the severity of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles for Germany and the Treaty of Sevres for the Ottoman Empire, both of which led to terrible consequences. For the Ottoman Empire, it led to years of regional and national uprising and rebellion with the armies of the Allies, mainly British and French, that then came to an exhausted close in the Treaty of Lausanne, but not to the end of conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. I'll come back to that shortly. And we all know about the brutality of the Treaty of Versailles vis-a-vis Germany. So the question that kept on coming to my mind is, why did it take a further 5 years to see the end of conflict? So just as a recap, the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that forced Germany to surrender all of its colonies in Africa, in Asia, in the Pacific, to cede some of its territory to other nations, to like France and Poland, to reduce the size of its military, to pay war reparations to the Allied countries, and to accept guilt for the war. But Germany wasn't torn apart. The Treaty of Sevres was officially dismantling the Ottoman Empire, forcing it to relinquish its claims to territories in North Africa and the Middle East, and recognizing independent or autonomous areas for Armenia, for Kurdistan, and for parts of Greece, for Thrace. Many in Turkey, we're going to call them nationalists, although Professor Asuni is now making us wonder, what does it mean to be nationalist? Nationalists in the sense of people who want to have their own nation state, as was developed in 19th century Europe, I could put it that way. They rejected the treaty. They didn't sign. It was only the Ottoman representatives of the Caliph in Constantinople who signed the Treaty of Sevres, but the nationalists rejected it and fought. I'm not going to say to create a larger Ottoman Empire, but to create a nation state, a republic, on the model of what we've seen in Europe, very homogeneous populations. So that eventually ended up with the Treaty of Lausanne. But the original Treaty of Sevres intended to territorially carve up what was called the sick man of Europe. And that's the term that I'm really interested in. Britain and France had already decided what would happen to that area generally, referred to as the Middle East. And of course, they attempted to take, well, they did take effective possession and control of Palestine, while France also took effective possession over parts of Greater Syria and some of the land in southern Anatolia. So where does this idea of the sick man of Europe come from, and not the sick man of the Orient or the sick man of the Middle East? And that's why I want to go back to some of the Crimean War of the 19th century, the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. Just as a reminder, the Ottoman Empire was part of the Comity of Nations. This was a legal understanding in the 1850s. And so when the Crimean War erupted, I always call that the fight over who had the right to the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Because under the capitulations and other extended gifting of the Sultan in Constantinople, the France, under the capitulations, was meant to be looking after Catholics in the empire, and Russia, its capitulation was to look after the Orthodox. But over time, the French had become a bit lazy about it, and the Russian monks had pretty much taken over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So Napoleon III was kind of annoyed about that, and he went back and he asked for the keys, which the Sultan said, well, you're absolutely right. He gave it to them. But the Imperial Russia was so upset about that, they attacked the Ottoman Empire, they sank the entire naval fleet in the Black Sea, and frightened the rest of the Comedy of Nations, France and Great Britain, to fight back. So you had the Ottoman Empire, France, and Great Britain fighting against Russia, Imperial Russia. Imperial Russia lost that war. And in its defeat, it had to give back Crimea, and it had to give back part of the Danube Basin. But in that Treaty of Paris of 1856, Russia was not carved up by the defeat. And even the same is true. You mentioned the Russian-Ottoman War of 1877-1878, and the Treaty of Berlin, which came out of it. That the Ottoman Empire was defeated, and it had to release some of its European territory and grant self-governance to, I think, was Bulgaria, Serbia, maybe Romania, plus particular terms for monitoring the treatment of Armenians in Eastern Anatolia. What it didn't look at was the large waves of dispossessed Muslims from the Crimea, from these border areas, who were coming into the Ottoman Empire and also creating real disturbances. So you had huge number of Muslims coming in from the Caucasus into the area that is Armenia, but it's also Kurdistan, because when you look at a map of Armenia and Kurdistan, you find there's a great deal of overlap. And now you had into this mix displaced Muslims who were creating huge problems, as they were also doing in the area called Romeli in what later on we think of as Bulgaria. So even in 1878, with the defeat, the Ottoman Empire wasn't carved up. So my question to you is why, after World War I, was Germany made to take the blame for starting the war, but it wasn't carved up? And yet the Ottoman Empire was supposed to be carved up, basically following the terms of the secret wartime agreements, which you very clearly put forward, but carved up between France, Great Britain, Russia, and then of course Italy had some parts, Greece had some parts, and so on. So I think that there's a change of attitude in how wars are fought and how wars are solved that takes place after the Edwardian period that I wonder if you could maybe comment on. Or are we looking at something that was more than just a European war with an Eastern front, but a very important colonial venture, particularly for France and for Great Britain? I mean, I think Great Britain's need to defend the Suez Canal and its link with India was an important factor in why they went along with this effort to carve up the empire. So it's a wonderful piece of scholarship. But what I found missing, and I know that you're taking the European view, but maybe we can discuss this, is why the Arab allies to the British after the Hussein-McMahon agreement, I don't call it just an exchange, why were they treated as basically as a conquered peoples, as allies? Why weren't they permitted to have their kingdom, which basically they set up for 2 years, but it wasn't recognized? Why were they then designated as Class A mandates, all of this southern part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not set up as Class A mandates? You ended up with Hungary, Austria, and then a whole bunch of weak states like Poland, Romania, Serbia, Czechoslovakia. And this was a question that many of the Arabs asked and put forward to the King Crane Commission, and also the Emir Faisal asked in Paris. And interestingly enough, you know, this is just really an aside. The Ottomans had a long period of reform called the Tanzimat, and part of their reforms was also a clothing reform. So the Ottomans, certainly by the 1860s, 1870s, the elite, the educated, adopted proper Western clothing for formal occasions. In their education system, after Turkish, French was a very important language. And of course, the Emir Faisal was educated in Constantinople. And when he attended the conference in 1919, he spoke in French. And you know who needed a translator who couldn't understand him? Woodrow Wilson. And of course, he spoke occasionally when he attended these meetings. He dressed in top, you know, in tails and top hat. He didn't wear the kind of what are considered indigenous clothing. So, I mean, what I wished I had seen a little bit more of, but then of course you can't cover everything in the book, is why that war continued. What was it that was happening in the Middle East that was rejecting the Treaty of Sèvres? And this is where I think the capitulations were very important, because the capitulations were what gave France, not so much the United Kingdom, but Germany, Russia, sort of the right to look after their co-religionists in the Ottoman Empire. And as this multicultural empire began to have much of its Christian population squeezed out, you know, if you think in the mid 18th century, the minority population of the Ottoman Empire was about 40% Christian, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish. And Istanbul, in fact, even until the end of the 19th century, was 45% Armenian Christian. So we're talking about minorities, but we're talking about really large groups. And because of this, the millet system of this kind of semi-self-rule of these ethno-religious minorities, they were spread out all over the empire, which is one of the problems for Armenians, because of course you had a concentration of Armenians in Eastern Anatolia, but you had a large Armenian population in Constantinople, large Armenian population in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Cairo, throughout this period. So you can almost understand why there would be a resistance to this idea of the colonization, if I could put it, of the Middle East at the end of this fighting. I just stopped by saying a little bit about a companion book that came out last year by Jonathan Wertzen called World Making in the Long Great War. So he's taking your point and saying the war didn't end in 1918. He claims it ended in 1928. But I would say it didn't end until 1936, when Syria finally got the French to agree to give them a date for when they could become an independent state. But his book is really very interesting because he basically is de-Europeanizing the Great War. He's looking at the Great War from the Middle East. He starts with the inland occupation of Morocco by France and Spain and Italy in Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. But what he does is he turns to look at what happened in the Ottoman Empire as the Europeans basically scrambled for colonial territory. That's what I see as the Eastern Front. And it's a very sad conclusion, but what he does show that only a few of these nationalist or local struggles succeeded. And one he considers is the Republic of Turkey and the suppression of Kurdish identity. The second one he sees, of course, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the suppression of its Ikhwan, and then the Sanusi struggle and the unification of Libya. But the huge struggle that went on really throughout the whole of the 1920s for a Kingdom of Syria or Greater Syria was shut down after the French really were engaged in 10 years of serious pacification. Of course, independent Kurdistan never came into being. And the Republic of North Africa, I hadn't realized, also struggled for 5 years against the French and was finally shut down. So I guess what I'm saying is I would have liked to have seen a better understanding of why that struggle continued for 5 years, what was powering it, what kind of nationalism had emerged from 19th century Europe, you could say, but also in the way that the capitulations had in place, particularly after the 1880s, so many missionaries to work with the minority Christian populations that were coming under increasing conflict with the millions of Muslims that were forced out of the borderlands areas of Transcaucasus and also out of the Balkans. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm happy to respond to both comments together. Would that be all right?
Yeah, sure.
So I'll be grouping them.
Yes.
And it seems, if I've taken my notes correctly, there's a we'll talk. I'll answer the questions about humanitarianism, minorities, nationalism, and then your great question at the end: why did it take so long? That's why I kind of started this book. It did seem to take an inordinately long time to settle this war, and in fact, I think it speaks to this moment where we're really blurring boundaries to the point where the inner war is disappearing. I mean, it's a terrible name, right? Interwar, like it's clumsy. It doesn't quite, but I don't know that we need to completely eliminate it. So I think the humanitarian question is the one I care about most. And thank you, Ron, for bringing that up. I'm really speaking against those scholars and those debates that seem to see humanitarianism as either good or bad. It isn't either. It becomes a factor, and it becomes used in the concentration camp chapter that I have in these multiple ways that actually, if we understand how it's embedded in the military, if we understand humanitarianism military pedigree, and we understand its 19th century push with this diplomatic story with the British, I think we can really fully understand the action of a humanitarian ethos as driving diplomacy, politics, philanthropy. So I do think that this idea of whether it's good or bad, it really shields us from the crucial question is, how did it grow up? How is it used? How is it instrumentalized? And what are the things it actually does? So I think it's too easy of an answer to say it's simply a tool of colonialism. I wouldn't deny that it is, and it can be, but it's not the only way it's used. And I think that singular way of seeing it blinds us to the ways that it is embedded in the very fabric of diplomacy today, of military action. And we can just sort of, in some ways, just say, well, it's colonialism, we have to write it off. We also have to understand that humanitarian actions do actually work in some cases. They don't work the way we think they should work sometimes, but when they turn death camps in, I shouldn't use the word death camps, but when they turn those camps of mass slaughter in the Ottoman Empire into sites of aid in World War I, that was a real action. that had a real effect. And I think we have to take humanitarianism seriously as a tool of many different forces. So that's how I would respond to the critics of humanitarianism. I think we just can't see it as a good or a bad thing. On the question of minorities, and here I want to talk about the Kurds and the Arabs, because Don, you brought that up, and Ron, you brought. I think those two are part of the same piece, and I think this is a diplomatic problem. The Kurds don't have representation at Versailles in the same way. And the Arabs are treated as second-class citizens from the very beginning. And you see how that plays out. And the promise is made. I don't think it's Faisal's fault, but I think it's the British and the French are competing with each other. And the Armenian issue is so embedded into the fabric of British thinking from the 19th century, this protection of these minorities, that it becomes an issue. You also can't ignore the kind of advocacy work that's done by the Jewish diaspora and the Armenian diaspora. Those two forces are incredibly powerful in this moment, and they work together. And they work together on a lot of levels, especially in 1917, 1918. You see them collaborating, and they get in the door to go see Lloyd George. And I think that really matters. And I don't think Faisal does not have this. He's with Allenby, but Allenby is the general. Lloyd George it's different, right? Having a backdoor to Allenby or having a backdoor to and both the Armenians and the Jewish delegations have that access. And I think that matters. That might be too simple of an answer, but in this world of European politics of top hats and European tailored suits, that kind of access, I think, really matters. It's not that they don't talk about the Kurds. It's not that they're not ashamed in some cases of what they're doing to the Arabs. You can see it. they just don't have the same kind of access. And I hope that's not too simple of an answer, but that's kind of what I've seen. The two diasporas that are working really, really, really hard in this moment for their case are the Armenians and the Jewish diaspora. And you see that manifest in the documents. The idea of nationalism, oh, that's such a hard question. Yes, I do use it as a shorthand, and I am guilty as charged, because the nationalism question is one that is so thorny. But I do think that its explanatory force is undermined by its widespread use. But in this moment, I think the best case I can give is that a lot of these small nationalities really liked the mandate system. I know we're not supposed to say that, but they were like, this is great because then no one can invade us. and they saw it in the way that it was being packaged to them, that independence would come, but we'll protect you in the short term. So you take a mandate, and now we have the force of, it's the old imperial model, right? You're with the big dog, right? Like, if Britain is making sure that you're not invaded, why would we deny that as a possibility? So I think we need a reassessment of the mandate story from the perspective of the small nationalities who actually see some good in being protected by British and French forces. Now, I'm not saying they are pro-colonial. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that they see a usefulness in the colonial apparatus, because these are not, small nationalities are not thinking in terms of nation. They're thinking in terms of empire, and they do not want to be gobbled up by an empire that they see as hostile to their interests. So the Armenians are quite happy to have an American mandate or a British mandate in the beginning stages. I think you see that with the Assyrians. It's harder to parse out the Assyrians, because they are a quieter voice. They are more powerful than the Kurds, certainly, in this moment, but not so much so. But I do think that we have to reassess the mandates to fully understand nation in this moment, because the mandates for small nationalities that are breaking free of empire, they're still in an imperial frame. They are not seeing themselves in modern nation state status at this moment. They see threats all around them. In some way, I think it's sort of a Roman. I see it as a sort of Roman. They want the protection of these empires, but they don't want them butting into their internal affairs. Of course, we know that's not what they get, but that would be my response to the national question. I hope I haven't dodged that one either too much. And finally, this question of why did it take so long? Oh, yes. And it's the periodization question, right? By talking about the last treaty and seeing World War I from the rearview mirror of Lausanne, we really, I think, do see a conflict that is shaped from the beginning by concerns about the Middle East that we have ignored. So the first part of the book really talks about those early days and why that matters in terms of how it's understood in the Western Front. And so I think if we have to answer that question of why it took so long, is that we've been looking at it the wrong way around. We think, oh, well, it ended in Germany and it ended in the West. But actually, what's happening in the Middle East is determining what's happening in the West. And that if we can understand these two as coming together, it isn't that it took so long, it's that this was a long war. It's just the only thing we have been looking at is what happens with Germany. And from the beginning, the German and the Middle Eastern questions are tied up. And that's where I get back to your point, Ron, about the Belgian atrocities and the Armenian genocide. Those two guiding forces, those reasons for war, they do shape one another. And when Lloyd George comes in, he's like, we got to win. We got to win somewhere. And the only place we're going to win is in the Middle East, because we're not winning in the West. And so I would say, rather than saying, why does it take so long, is that I think we should actually start understanding the totality of this war as being having this end date that is influencing what's happening in the West as well. Now, the German reparations, all of these things are still being talked about at those conferences between Sèvres and Lausanne. It's not over for Germany either, in a lot of ways, right? They are talking about what to do with Germany for a lot of years. So I would hope that instead of saying, why does it take so long for the Ottoman Empire, we would start understanding this war. If you go back to my first map, if we flatten it out and we say that this war actually is existing on this plane for Germany, for the Ottoman Empire, for the Alpine Front, for all these other forces, then I think we get a more complex understanding of a very, very long war. And I also appreciate, Professor Chatty, you saying this is about the 19th century, because I fully agree. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Tusan and the panelists for your wonderful commentaries. Now we would like to open the floor for discussion, a short discussion. I would like to go to Professor J. Winter. And Professor Winter, if you have any comments or any questions, please you can bring up. And I would also request, along with Professor Tusan and Professor Suni and Chatty can also join this conversation. So yes, over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Sumavo, and thank you very much, Michelle. It's a great pleasure in marking a breakthrough in historiography. I think we should understand that the centenary of the Great War did not create major new interpretations. I think it was a bit of a disappointment in some respects. Maybe there was too much memory and too little history, but there was a lot going on of a political nature and less of historiography. But your book is an exception to that, and I want to congratulate you on offering a new way of seeing not just the end of the war, but the whole war itself. And what I'd like to do is draw you out on two matters, basically to draw you into 5 days, the 30th of January, 1923 to the 4th of February. It seems to me there are two things that happen there that are so important that they tend to be treated separately from the treaty. The first is Curzon's bluff. I'm going home. The whole thing is going to collapse when my imperial dignity is removed from the scene. And Mustafa Ismet calls his bluff. It seems to me one of the most important moments in the history of 20th century empire. The emperor has no clothes. So the first thing is that the bluff, what do you make of it? And why did it, if you talk about why it took so long, then they had to reconstitute the conference in second phase, then deal with the capitulations and other financial and economic issues. So I'd like to ask you about how did Ismet pull it off? And I think the answer is the second issue that I want to deal with, which is the population exchange agreement, which was signed just before, which seems to me to be the assurance that the treaty is going to be signed no matter what. Because the most powerful and divisive issue has been, let's call it for a moment, settled. And I think it's true, and please, Michelle, tell me if you can find the 19th century examples to prove me wrong. I'd be very happy to learn that. It's the first time that I know that a war ended not through an exchange of prisoners of war, but through a compulsory exchange of populations, not, shall we say, a voluntary exchange of populations, but a compulsory exchange with standing in international law. And that seems to me what happens on the 30th of January, 31st of January, as it were, assurance that the whole treaty is going to be signed. Once that goes on, then Curzon's bluff no longer has any force. So I'd like to ask you about those two issues. Why did Curzon do this? After all, I know his back hurt and he was sick and he wasn't going to be elected prime minister and so on. But it's an embarrassing moment when you play poker and you don't have a hand that you can actually defend. This for the British Empire is something I think that everyone has drawn a veil of discretion over because it's a humiliation. And that humiliation reflects something that maybe I would say I would put more emphasis on, which is economic powerlessness. Maybe, just maybe, the outcome of Lausanne was set by the fact that neither Britain nor France had the financial power to ensure a settlement. They certainly weren't going to pay for 100,000 troops or more to enforce a settlement. What they wanted was to go back to business as usual. Of course, they couldn't do it quite in the way they did in the past, but the betrayal of the British by the French seems to me to be a function of two things. the invasion of the Ruhr by the French, and French willingness and the necessity of the French to go back to earning money in Turkey, where they had huge investment, to cover the fact, as Ron, you know better than anybody, that immense loss of French investment through Bolshevik seizure of portfolios that constituted, I think, between 16 and 20% of the French overseas investment. So what I'm asking is, when you take those 5 days, Michelle, the 30th of January to the 4th of February, do you see something really unusual in the exchange of populations? And it's really unusual about the fact that, you know, you walk out of a peace conference and basically nothing happens? I'd like to draw you out on those two, because the framework you said is so powerful and I think so important, that these, you know, what shall I call them? These small scale pirouettes that seem to me to be critical in the outcome of the treaty is something that I really like to hear you interpret. So if you could, I'd be very, very grateful to hear.
Well, those are great. Those are actually my favorite. Those are my favorite moments, kind of in the conference when Curzon, you know, Curzon doesn't storm out, but the Turkish delegation storms out first, and so they're playing their hand much more in a much more sophisticated way, because we focus on Curzon so much, but he only does this after the Armenian question is raised and the Turkish delegation's in the room and they leave. So in some ways, Curzon is responding, and in that case, it bolsters your point that he does have a weak hand. I think domestic politics, we talk about the international in Britain, but we don't talk about the domestic. Yes, Curzon writes mournfully to his wife, "I'll never be prime minister." Well, poor you, right? And he doesn't want to do the second part of the conference because he knows he's sunk, even though he has his hands in everything. You know, you've seen the correspondence. Curzon's like, well, do this, do that, do that. But is it 4 prime ministers in this moment? I mean, I think we have, and we've got labor, and we've got the unrest of labor at home. And when they have to sell this treaty to the British population, remember, I mean, democracies fight wars. And if you're not going to put more men into uniform, if people do not believe in this war, if they're not fighting for the liberation of the Belgians or the Armenians, and they're just fighting for oil, it's a harder sell. And when you look at the domestic correspondence and who they have to justify putting more boots on the ground, at Chanak especially, labor will not support them. They will not. And so I think that the domestic context is crucial here for Britain. Now for France, I think the competition with Britain is crucial, right? They don't want the British to get one step ahead of them, and they're willing to cut off their nose to spite their face in some ways. And I think there could be more subtle analysis. I'm clearly a British historian in this, but for the British case, we don't pay enough attention to the domestic when we talk about the international and foreign policy. I think you look at the letters between, you know, with the new prime ministers, they're like, I don't care about Mesopotamia. It's like, I just don't care. Just like, let it go. And so Curzon really doesn't have the backing of Whitehall. He doesn't have the backing that he can't do it. So there is a lack of will at home, because the British really, there is no will to fight this war anymore. The woman of no importance is that cartoon I start with. The population exchange, I've been working a lot on this. So I'm going to give a talk in the spring about the unmixing of populations. Curzon never said it, right? He never said it. And where he gets the idea, and I'm sure you know this, it isn't him. Nansen doesn't, it's Nansen's term, to unmix. He says to unmix, right? There's no one has ever said the unmixing of populations except historians starting in the 80s. Okay, so that's, I shouldn't reveal it, but that's, you know, it's an interesting factor, right? So what happens, I think, is Nansen is pushed to do this because when he meets with the Ottomans in October, when he meets with the Turkish delegation, I should say, they say, you finish it or we will. You get rid of these populations or we'll do it. And so when Nansen comes to Lausanne, he's not proposing this pie in the sky idea. He has been told, also Smyrna has burned. if we can remember this, right? Smyrna's burned. He's told that by the Turkish delegation, when he goes to visit them, that we're going to get rid of these minorities. And he appears at the conference in January to say we should unmix populations. I think what we're missing here, the missing link, is we're not paying enough attention to the diplomacy launched. It isn't that the British were weak, it's that the Turkish delegation was strong. And I don't think that's just parsing words. I think that because the idea is that the West does everything to the East, there's a sort of Saidian sort of psychology here, that we don't actually listen to what the Ottoman delegation is doing. Yes, they outmaneuver the British because they have burned this city to the ground, and it's terrifying. And what you're going to do in the aftermath of that. So I think by the time we get to January, you have to understand British domestic politics have changed, not to mention Greek politics. Greek politics are in a mess, right? But also that the Ottoman delegation has basically said, Anatolia is our homeland, and we're gonna die for it. You know, they've given up on Mesopotamia, but they're gonna die for Anatolia. And that is really clear. And so when we say that Curzon doesn't maneuver it right, or that the population exchange was just a sort of capitulation, no, it happens in October. I think I wouldn't move to January. I would say this is all about October. It's Chanak, it's that Nansen going there. It's already been decided. So that would be my explanation for why Lausanne takes its form. And I think we need to stop thinking that the British Empire is there, the marionette pulling all the strings, but that it's rather one player amongst others. So I think I'd want to decenter my narrative a little bit in that sense. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So we do not have any questions from the participants at the moment. So yeah, we can take maybe one or two more questions. We have a question, I think, from Professor Suni. Yes, Professor Suni, yes, over to you, please. You are muted.
My audio. Okay. Okay now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to comment on the comment. I liked very much the comments that were made by my co-commenter and by Jay Winter as well. So what's interesting is it's not only the Ottoman Empire, as you know, but another empire was also dismantled, right? And that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that was and Wilson was clear that he was going to do that. And so what you end up with, and I defer to Jay and to Michelle and others who know World War I far better than I do, but it seems to me there are like three levels that this conference in Paris is arranging who's going to get what and what concessions can be made. So West European countries, you know, many of them victors, but there are going to be no requirements basically about how to deal with minorities or whatever. Correct me if I'm wrong. East European countries are at another level. They're going to have to obey minorities treaties. So they're not quite as sovereign as some. And then Middle Eastern countries, they become mandates, as was mentioned. So that's very interesting that there are different levels that I think Dawn is hinting at that are very important. The other thing I would want to say is that there's a huge change after our time, after the era, a time we're thinking about. And that is sometime after, what would it be, 1922? The idea of having the Turks recreate an empire is eliminated. That is, early in the Kemalist period, they're still thinking in some ways about empire, Mosul maybe, or the Caucasus or something, and that's given up. And you have then really another kind of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and as Michelle put it, Anatolia is our homeland. Remember, Anatolia was not the original homeland of the Ottomans. The Balkans were. They discovered Anatolia after they had conquered Istanbul, Constantinople. And so after they lose the Balkan Wars, what have they got left but Anatolia? And that becomes a homeland, and Armenians and Assyrians are in the way. And just one more thing, small thing. In my own book on the Armenian genocide, They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else, I try to make an argument. Maybe it doesn't work, but I think I found something, and that is that the Young Turks were not ethno-nationalists. They were not going to do what the Kemalists did later. They were empire preservers. But the empire was going to be reconceived, certainly not, as they themselves had early argued, as an Ottomanist, egalitarian, multinational, diverse empire, right? But as more Turkic, more Islamic, and basically even more Turkic because they didn't quite trust the Kurds. So there's a kind of nationalization of the imperial idea, but they don't want to give up the the Arab lands. That's in there. And it takes a long time before even the Kemalists ultimately give up the idea that they're more than an ethno-national state. And eventually they do by the 1923, 24, 25, whenever it's stated in different ways. Anyway, that was something that I thought I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Chatty had raised her hand. Yes, Professor, you can go ahead.
Yes, I just want to carry on a little bit along this line, because I think one of the things that is often forgotten about the Middle East or the Arab world, but Elizabeth Thompson has a wonderful book called How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, is that there was a very powerful political elite throughout the southern Ottoman part of the empire, people who recognized that they were Arab ethnically, but they were Ottomans. And they were very aware of Woodrow Wilson. In fact, they admired him and they thought his 14 points were amazing. And I mean, I've actually read most of the King Crane Commission reports of their interviews with elites, Arab, Kurds, Armenians, Druze, Jews, everybody. It's very, very clear that, and in fact, I think a few of them, I remember one quote was kind of like, why is Serbia considered more civilized than us? You know, we're more civilized than the Serbs, is kind of the statement that is made. So, you know, I know we didn't coin Orientalism until Edward Said's wonderful work in the 1970s, but there was, an incredible Orientalism that really was growing by the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, that I think was powered by the kind of colonial greed, the kind of looking at this area as this is an empire that it's sick, so we're going to divide it up and this is what we're going to do with it. But the population didn't feel that way. And I think, that's, I find that even when we talk about Mustafa Kemal, I mean, there's another great paper that I read about how the French, once they had, Syria mandated to them by the League of Nations, began running around looking for Syrians to populate Damascus, because so many of the Damascene elite were in Constantinople and they had their businesses there, they had their money there, and they didn't necessarily want to go back to Damascus because they still had this mindset of being part of an empire that you could move around in, which so many of the religious minorities knew. I mean, you could be a merchant in Syria moving between Baghdad and Constantinople and Egypt, whatever, and then suddenly that wasn't going to be allowed anymore because there were borders, because there was going to be a French mandated area of Syria, Lebanon, British mandated area of Iraq. I don't even know why that particular name was decided upon. I don't know, was that Lawrence? Was that Gertrude Bell? Anyway, so I just feel that, these struggles in the region, we need to understand, not because it's a population that was poorly educated or didn't have an elite, but well, even for the Arabs, they didn't come out on the wrong side, because they were supporting Allenby in his march, beyond Jerusalem to Damascus, although he was a bit afraid about going to Aleppo. And I think there was a lot of secret negotiations between Allenby and Mustafa Kemal as to whether he would be moving his troops in, whether Aleppo would stay part of Syria or not. So it was a really complicated time, but it really showed the kind of struggle of civilization, maybe, although I hate that term, but the struggle to be recognized as a people who had a right to self-determination, which in the end only came through the force of Mustafa Kemal, but the rest of the Arab world couldn't, and we won't talk about Palestine. It's too complicated. Yeah, just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, Professor Tusan, would you like to reply or anything, comment? Yes.
Well, we're well past time, and I just have to say thank you. This was such a wonderful engagement. Like, it just really made me. I kind of wish before it was published I had this, so I could have included these things into the book. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate you reading the work and just engaging it and your expertise. It just this book meant a lot to me to write. I feel like I'd been writing this book for the last 10 to 15 years. I just didn't know it, and I'm glad it's out there, and I hope it has an afterlife too. And I'm like, all of your work has been an inspiration to me. So, and I thank you. And thank you, Somava, for inviting me and putting together such a wonderful panel. So just my gratitude today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. And today's event, it was the main important thing which I felt, the question of interwar periods. Today, as Professor Tusan mentioned, Professor Chatty also mentioned during her commentary, and even Professor Winter wrote in her book as well. Like, I think the question of the interwar period or the post-war period, the periodization, comes into a big question for the upcoming day historians of World War I. Yes, this was the biggest takeaway for me, and as well as the book you wrote. It was excellent, and we hope the readers and the viewers who will watch this recording would find it fascinating and would read your book. And we wish everyone best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.